So I'm going to go back into the toolbox, and I'm going to give that a try for my ozone data and see what happens. So I get a message box that says there are not any gaps in the date and times in my pollutant data, so that's good. So for my ozone data, I don't have any gaps, so I just click OK. You could also just use this to check if you have gaps. You don't have to have the toolbox do that filling in of the gaps, but you can just check if it has it, because it will give you another message box after this. But for now, I'm going to click OK on this. And now we're going to look at all of the wonderful reports and charts that the toolbox has available. So the way this form is set up is these yellow areas are labels that tell you what these different charts or reports are. So right under the input required area, we have quality control reports and charts. And then up here, we have our hourly pollutant concentration reports and charts. And then we can do some comparisons with our MET data and our pollutant reports and charts, and then we can run some averages. And over here, if you have a lot of ozone data, you can run ozone max, but you have to have at least 3 years of ozone data to run these. So, and you also have to complete this part of the form, this other form, the ozone max form, to do this. So I'm not going to demonstrate these ozone datas. Since I only have 2 weeks of ozone data in my toolbox, that's not appropriate for me. But there is a whole entire form dedicated to that, and if you're interested in doing that, I encourage you to read the SOP for that. So I am going to start with looking at my QC data. So this, remember, is the QC data that you enter. So you go out to your sampler and you run a QC check, and check your zero value, check your known versus your measured value, and then you type that information into the toolbox in the QC data entry form. And now, since you've done that, we have the ability to look at the reports and charts, and these are really cool, and they allow you to analyze your results of your QC checks, as we will see. I'm just going to work down this list. The first one in the list is just a report quality control check. So let's open up that report. Just click on the button, and now you'll see the report. So a couple things to mention about reports. So when you open a report, as well as a chart, it comes up in print preview mode, and the ribbon on top shows various options, and including print. So if you want to print out a paper copy of this, you could do that. If you want to go back to the report and charts form in the toolbox, you simply close this report by clicking on Close Print Preview. And when you first open the reports, they might show up as kind of small and hard to read, but if you mouse over the report, the magnifying glass comes up, and you can click and zoom in on the report. So that brings the report bigger. And another thing to mention is the page number. So if you scroll to the bottom, in the bottom right corner of the report, it tells you how many pages are in the report. So you'll see in this particular report, we have 3 pages. And if you want to go to the next page of the report, use these navigation buttons on the left-hand side of the screen. So if you want to go to the next page, you would click this next page button. If you want to go to the very last page of the report, you would click this last page button. So that's how you move through the reports. Now, just note that I'm using Microsoft Access 2013, and things might be slightly different in your other versions of Microsoft Access. And if you have any questions on how the reports look, please let us know. So let's look at this report in a little bit more detail. So let's look at the top of it here. So this is the header of the report, and it gives us various details about the QC check. Most importantly, it gives us the date and the time the QC check was performed. So this particular QC check was performed on 8/8/2013 at 8:02 a.m. And then if we scroll down and look at this, so it tells us the different checks that we performed. So we did a shelter temperature and it passed. Our zero check failed, and it tells us why it failed in parentheses. So these in parentheses is the pass-fail criteria taken directly from the EPA guidance. So we can tell that the absolute value of the output must be less than 0.003 parts per million. Ours was 28 parts per billion, so that is why that QC check failed. Then we have our known versus measured checks, and we can see that all of those passed. And again, you can see in the parentheses what the EPA criteria is for passing. So the percent difference between the known and the measured value must be less than or equal to 7 for ozone in order for those checks to pass. And if we scroll to the bottom again, we could go to the next page of the report, and that would show us the second QC check we performed on our data, which was on 8/8/2013 at 8:50 a.m. So each page of the report shows the QC check. Each page of the report is for one QC check. So there's 3 pages in this report because I did 3 QC checks during the date range selected. Now I'd like to see my QC data in chart format, so I'm going to close this report by clicking on Close Print Preview. And now I'm going to look at some of the charts that are related to my QC check data. So let's take a look at this first one. So let's take a look at the shelter temperature chart. So this chart shows us the shelter temperature we measured on each of the 3 checks. So in most of the QC charts, there's a solid line indicating the same pass-fail criteria that's shown in the report, and that's taken directly from the EPA guidance. So you'll see in this report that we have a line at 20 degrees Celsius and 30 degrees Celsius. So that means that each of the checks need to be within this range in order to be considered passing. So you can see that these little dots here are within that range for each of these checks was within that range because each of these 3 dots fall within this area. So we know that those 3 checks were passing for our shelter temperature. So we will close this report and move on, or this chart, and move on to the next chart. So the next chart is our 0 QC checks chart, and we will take a look at that by clicking on that button. So that's interesting. Look at here. We have 2 dots, but our 3rd check for some reason does not have a dot, and that's very suspicious. I'm not sure what happened here, so I need to do some investigation because that should not have been missing, because I know I had a 0 check for my 3rd QC check. So I'm going to close this chart and look at that report in more detail because I'm not sure what's going on here. So I'm going to close Print Preview, and now I'm going to go back to the report and take a look at that. So I am going to go to the last page of the report to see that last QC check. Okay, so look at our 0 check here. The 0 check is showing up without any indication of pass or fail. So something obviously went wrong here. And now I'm noticing that there is no 0 device display listed, and my 0 input is listed as 2 instead of what it usually is of 0. So I think I made a data entry error here because that is not right. So I need to go back into the QC data entry form and fix this. So I'm going to close Print Preview and go back into that form and fix that. I also am going to make sure in my database logbook that my QC check was supposed to be 2 parts per billion for my 0 check, and I confirm that the device display value was supposed to be 2 parts per billion. So I just made a data entry error that I can easily fix. So to fix it, I'm just going to make this form smaller because it's maximized and I want to go to a different form. So let's make this form smaller by clicking on the Restore button. And now let's see, I can go into the Fast Track form because I see it's sticking out slightly to the side. And I want to go back to the QC data entry form. So I'm going to click on Data Inflow and I go into Enter Quality Control Data. Now when I first open this form, it's a blank record because the toolbox that expects that I'm going to be entering a new QC check. So what I need to do is navigate to find that QC check where I made the data entry error. So to navigate through this form, I use these buttons on the bottom left. So I want to go back to a previous record. So I click on this, and you'll notice this is a PM 2.5 check. I need to find that Ozone check that was on 8/22. So I go back again, another PM 2.5 check, and now we're back to the Ozone check that was on 8/22. And look what is going on here. So I mistakenly entered the 2 into the 0 input known field instead of the 0 device display field, and that caused that not to show up on my chart. So I need to fix this. So my 0 input was supposed to be 0. So I can highlight the 2 by clicking and dragging and then entering 0. Then I tab into the 0 device display field and enter 2, which was what it was supposed to be all along. So I enter 2 there. And then I tab out of the field just to see if the toolbox flags this record. So let's see if the toolbox assigns a flag to this record. And it doesn't, so the check is okay. If it had, I might want to go back through my final data validation step and invalidate some data. but since this check was passing, we're all good. And that's it. That's how I fix that incorrect data entry. So I can go ahead and close my QC form. So I'll exit out of my QC form, and then I can exit out of my continuous and meteorological monitoring data operations form. And now I can go back into the reports and charts form and see what fixing that did. So go back into reports and charts. And let's take a look now at this zero check chart again. Oh, good. Look what happened. So here's my little dot like it should be. So I made this correction and I am good now. Another thing to notice, which I couldn't notice before because I was too caught up with why there wasn't a dot here, is that here is the zero check that was out of range. And you'll notice it's out of the little area between these two solid lines. So that means that it was a failing zero check according to the EPA guidelines. My other two zero checks are within this range, so that is good. And that was because I repeated this. Remember on 8/8, I saw this was not a good value. So I repeated my check on 8:50 a.m. and then it fell within the range. So that taught me something about my data entry. I need to be more careful next time. So I'm going to close print preview for now and move on to the next chart in the list. So the next chart is the QC relative percent difference. So let's click on that and see what kind of chart I get. So for each of the known versus measured checks, the toolbox calculates the relative percent difference. That's also abbreviated RPD. And that's represented by the dots on the chart. So there you can see that there's 4 dots for every check, and that's because I did 4 different concentration checks on my data. And you'll notice that the line is up at 7. So anything below the relative percent difference of 7 is considered passing for ozone data, according to my EPA guidelines. So you'll notice here that the highest difference between the relative percent of the known versus measured was this little diamond here. So if I look at my legend, I see that that's QC check number 1. So that was the highest relative percent difference. The others are all below 1%. Well, that looks pretty good. So I'll close print preview and go on to the next chart. So the next chart is chart of co-located samplers. I don't have a co-located ozone sampler, so I am not going to look at this chart since I don't have that, so I'm going to go ahead and skip that chart. So the next couple charts in the QC area have to deal with the QC check. So the concentration check I did on my ozone data, or if you were talking about PM 2.5 data, this would be your flow rate checks. So these charts are similar to this relative percent difference chart. The difference here is that you only look at one check at a time. So instead of seeing all of those 4 checks, you would just see one of the checks. So we have to select what check we want to look at. I had 4 checks that I could look at. The 5th one I didn't enter. But I want to look at that first one because that's where the relative percent difference was the greatest. So I'm going to look at that first one by selecting the number 1. And now I'm going to click on this next chart, QC check versus relative percent difference. So let's take a look at that. And this looks similar to that other chart, but there's just the one check, which is kind of nice to see because looking at a lot of data at once on a chart it can be very confusing. So this allows me just to look at that first check. And you'll see that the relative percent difference went down after the first one. So I'm going to close this chart and look at this next one. So the next one is known versus measured. So let's take a look at that. And this shows the known value versus the measured value. So the interesting thing to notice about this is that it seems that the measured concentration has been rising slightly, so there's a trend here that this is rising. And if I collect more QC data, it would be useful to see if this trend continues because there might be something wrong with my sampler. So I'm going to close print preview, and now we're going to move on to our hourly pollutant concentration reports and charts. So we'll go on to the section of the form here. So let's take a look at this first report. Report hourly concentration. And this is a report, not a chart, so I'm going to zoom in because this is awfully small. And now what this does is it lists the concentration data in a nice report format. And maybe you want to give this to your management or something like that. It's a lot easier to look at than it is for them in like a query format or a spreadsheet format. So one thing to notice here is that the first concentration value is null. And why is that null? Because I assigned an AQS null code to it. So in the final data validation step of the toolbox, I assigned an AQS invalidation code to that. That's why that is empty. So it has a qualifier, and I also assigned the invalidation code. Notice also that the next one here, actually there is a concentration, and I have a qualifier too, so I did not assign a code in the final validation step for this one. That's why that is still in my report. So that's the difference between flagging your data and invalidating your data. If you had just flagged it, it's still in your reports and charts. If you invalidate it, it shows up as a null value. Very important difference. So if I scroll to the bottom here, there's 13 pages in my report. On the very last page of the report is some useful summary statistics. So I'd like to take a look at that. So I want to go to the last page of the report, and that shows as last page. It looks like this little icon with a vertical bar next to it. So let's go to the last page of the report. And now you'll notice the toolbox does some calculations for you. So it calculates an average, a minimum, a maximum, and also a percent data completeness for the range selected shown on this last page. So remember, this is based on the range you selected on the form. So every time you change the date range, these values are going to change. So if you've imported Ozone data into the toolbox for an entire year, you could change the date range and get summary statistics for the entire year. So notice that in this example, the percent data completeness is 92.5%, not 100%. And there are two reasons for this. And the first is because I invalidated 3 values. So those values are not counted towards completeness. The second reason is because my data collection started at 8 a.m. on the first day, that was 8/8/2013, and it ended at 7 a.m. on the last date, which is 8/22/2013. So for this calculation, the toolbox counts the hours prior to 8 a.m. on the first day in the range, and the hours after 7 a.m. on the last day in the range as missing, since there are not any data in the toolbox for those hours. So percent data completeness is more useful after you have imported multiple new import text files into the toolbox and run the report for a date range spanning several imports. So that is something to be aware of. So I'm going to close print preview since I'm done looking at this report. And the next button in the list is the chart hourly concentration button. One important point about charts that show hourly pollutant concentrations is that they are best viewed for a date range of less than a month and can only present about 6 months of data without appearing too cluttered. So if you have a lot of data you want to look at, these charts are probably not what you want to use. If you have a lot of data that you want to look at, you can export it into Excel and do some modifications in Excel to make the chart look better. And we actually have a SOP on how to do that. So we have a SOP on how to export charts to Microsoft Excel. So we've already looked at this hourly concentration chart during the final data review process. I'll show it to you briefly, but we already looked at this report. So that's how this chart looks, but we already looked at it during final data validation. So I'll close that. And the next grouping has a long descriptive header of meteorological and hourly pollutant concentration data reports and charts. So these charts give you the option of plotting your pollutant data and your met data. If you collect met data and import that data into the toolbox, and if your met data is collected at the same site as your pollutant data. You can also view your met data independently from your pollutant data, and I will show you how to do that. But first, we're going to look at the reports for the pollutant data versus the met data on the same chart. So let's look at the first report, and that's the report met data. So this data, take a look at this. This shows you your meteorological data, kind of similar to it showed you your hourly pollutant concentration data in that other report. This is kind of the same report for your met data. So it goes through each of the hourly met data that you collect, and it lists it out. And you'll notice that this report has 19 pages. And if you go to the last page of the report, you'll see that it also has summary statistics. And for precipitation, I just wanted to note that instead of doing an average, it does a total. This particular 2-week interval, we had 3.1 inches of rain. And again, here's the percent data completeness, and notice that it's different for relative humidity versus ambient temperature and wind speed. So remember that I invalidated some of my ambient temperature data and some of my wind speed data, and that's why percent data completeness is less than it is for my percent relative humidity and for my precipitation, because for those I didn't have any data that I invalidated during this 2-week span. So I'm done looking at this report, and I'm going to close my preview and move on. So the next report is chart versus temperature. So these reports are actually really cool because you can look at your meteorological data and your pollutant data on the same chart. So let's take a look at how that works for temperature. If we look at our legend, if we had recorded internal temperature, we would also have another line for internal temperature. We don't collect that at our particular MET sampler, so we just have ambient temperature and pollutant concentration. So we have one line that represents our ambient temperature, and this is that yellow line with the triangle. And then we have the pollutant concentration that's represented by the bluish purple line with the diamond. And you'll notice here that the y-axis, this is the vertical axis, on the left of the chart is for your temperature data, and the y-axis, the vertical axis, on the right side of the chart is for your pollutant data. And here's something else interesting is it tells you what the maximum pollutant concentration was and when that occurred. This is also on the hourly pollutant concentration chart, and that's always something interesting to notice. So these charts could be very useful. For example, let's say you have a high PM 2.5 value and you want to compare that to your wind speeds that were collected at the site. So you could do that with these charts and see if that spike really correlates with the high wind speed. So I'm going to close this report, and I'm not going to go through all of these different reports because they're basically the same thing. They just have different MET parameters. So that is for you to explore on your own in the exciting world of data analysis. So the next thing I want to show you is how you would just look at your meteorological data. So let's say you just want to look at your chart for your ambient temperature. You don't want the pollutant data on there. You just want to look at ambient temperature. So to do that, what you need to do is you need to select your meteorological data sampler. So we need to change the sampler ID to INNet, which is my meteorological data sampler. And now you'll notice that blanked out the pollutant and the sampling year. So I want to change the pollutant, and notice that there's nothing in my drop-down box. That's good. That's what I want, because I don't want the pollutant selected, because I only want to look at my MET data. So I'm going to leave that blank, and then I'm going to select my sampling year, and I can leave this the same because this is the same range as my ozone data. That's the range I want to look at, so I don't need to change anything here. And then I'm going to click on the chart concentration versus temperature, and now we're going to see something different. So now when I click on this chart, I don't see my pollutant data anymore because I told the Toolbox that I only wanted to look at my meteorological data. So that's how you would look at just your meteorological data as opposed to your meteorological data versus your pollutant concentration data. So I'm going to close this chart and we're going to move on. The next thing we're going to look at is the average pollutant concentration reports that are shown here. So we have 4 different reports we can look at. These reports present the data summarized over a time period. So there's reports for daily summaries as well as summary periods that you specify. So let's say you want to look at your data over a 2-day range instead of just the daily range. You could do that by making a specification here. But first, we're going to look at just the daily concentration. So I'm going to click on the report daily averages and see what that does. Oh, what happened? You know what happened? I forgot to go back and change my sampler selection. So it's saying there is no pollutant concentration data. So I need to fix that first. So I need to change this to INO3, which is my ozone data, my ozone sampler and pollutant of ozone, and change my sampling year back to 2013. Now let's see if something different happens. Yay! So what this report does is pretty cool, is that for each day, it averages the concentration. So this might be something that your management wants to see. So for, let's say, August 10, 2013, the average ozone concentration was 41.1 parts per billion. And then on the bottom of the report, there is the summary statistics again, and these are based on the daily averages instead of the hourly averages. So we're going to close that report and move on to the next report. So let's take a look at how the daily averages with the net data look. So this report shows the daily ozone concentration values as well as the average net data parameters. And for precipitation, again, it doesn't average, it totals. So for example, on 8/11, we have an average ozone concentration of 47.3 parts per billion, and we have an average percent relative humidity of 74.7%, and we have a total precipitation value of 1.57 inches. So it rained 1.57 inches on 8/11. And then if we scroll to the last page again, we have our summer statistics, and you'll notice that it also tells you the number of data points here. So that's an interesting report to print out and give to your management. So I'm going to close this and move on to the next report. And these reports here allow you to average your data over a selected range. So let's say you want to look at a weekly average. You would enter 7 days in this area and then click on each of the reports, and that's what we're going to do. So I want to take a look at weekly averages, so I'm going to enter 7 here, and then I will click on report average concentration. So now for each of the weeks in my range, the Toolbox gives me an average, a minimum, a maximum, a count of the number of records, and a standard deviation. And you'll notice that we have 3 weeks in our report. And that's because I've only imported one biweekly ozone data set. So you can see by the count here that the 3rd week is incomplete. Since I don't have data after that in my Toolbox yet. So these reports might be more useful if you have a lot of data in your Toolbox that you want to look at. So I'm going to close this report. When you do this report, the Toolbox always starts with the beginning date of your range. So let's look at that one more time. So it starts with the beginning date that was in your range that you selected, and it adds 7 days to that, or however many days that you select. So we'll close this report and move on to our net data. So let's look at our weekly net data. So again, it's a very similar report. However, it doesn't show all of the different stats. It just shows the average. Or if you're talking about precipitation, it shows the total. So that first week is when we got all of the precipitation. There was no precipitation in the next couple weeks. At least this week's not complete yet, though, because we haven't imported all that data into the Toolbox yet. So that shows your average and your ozone average and your percent relative humidity average and your total inches of rain and your average temperature and your average wind speed. It got kind of windy here. Look, the average wind speed went up about twice as much as it was here. So these are cool to look at, and I will close print preview after I have thoroughly enjoyed looking at that report.